All right, so this picture is of Jalil camp number 1 or 791, located in present-day Herzliya. If you can see my cursor, this is today's coastal road, Kvish HaChof in Hebrew, and this is the Sirah Junction right here. And so it's a very centrally located, but very few people know when they drive by there that in 1948 it was a site of a mass detention camp for prisoners of war. Today I will speak about 3 major issues that the booklet also speaks about: deportations, subject formation, and resistance. So let's start with the numbers. From 1948 to January 1950, there were around 8,000 Palestinians incarcerated in these camps. Now, first we should talk about the terminology here. So POWs is how I will refer to these people, the Palestinians incarcerated by Israel in 1948, and also how they refer to themselves, but it is a rather inaccurate title, according to the Geneva Conventions. To actually be a prisoner of war, you need to belong to a certain army, you need to wear a uniform, you need to have a vigil, a sign on you, and the Palestinian incarcerated in these camps had none of these things. The Israeli side preferred the title prisoner of war as to mask the fact these people were imprisoned for no crime whatsoever. They were imprisoned because they were Palestinians. One logic was a logic of incapacitation to make sure people don't join the fighting. The other logic was to gather information from the people, the Palestinians imprisoned by Israel. From the Palestinian side, the title prisoner of war granted certain protections. So the booklet traces the story of the Palestinian POW Sa'el, Yusuf Sa'el, and he specifically mentions in his diary from 1948 that a few months before he was captured, he read the 1929 Geneva Conventions and understood the protections that the title prisoner of war grants, and therefore he wanted to be called prisoner of war so as to minimize the chances of him being arbitrarily executed upon capture. And there were arbitrary executions. We know the famous story from 1948, such as Ein Zaytun or Dwime, but also there was a direct order allowing the agents of the Shin Yud, the predecessor of the Shabak, to authorize, alongside the field commanders, executions of people captured. And so Sa'el was afraid with good reasons of execution, and the term POW granted him protection against such arbitrary executions. But like I said, these people weren't actually POWs. 82% of the camp's population were Palestinian non-combatants. 3% of the people incarcerated in these camps were combatants, and the remainder, 15%, were soldiers or officers from the neighboring armies. There were 5 major camps: Jalil, which is the one we just showed, this one, in Herzliya. Aklit was camp number 2. It was formerly a camp for illegal Jewish immigrants to Palestine during the British Mandate. Today, it's a museum for the history of illegal Jewish immigration. A fun fact about it, or maybe not so fun, is that this museum houses a research center that studies the history of the site, but the people working in the research center refused to acknowledge that Palestinians were incarcerated in this site in 1948. But there are plenty of documents that prove otherwise, that prove that Palestinians were incarcerated in the same site that Jews were incarcerated by the British earlier. Sarafand was camp number 3. This was a model camp, the camp that visitors were brought to see to show the alleged humane conditions of the camp. Sarafand was opened in 1936 by the British for Palestinians captured during the Great Revolt of 1936 to 1939, and then the Israelis reopened it in 1948 for Palestinians, and it was also a work camp. So the camps were used as sites of forced labor, of various jobs, such as emptying Palestinian houses, evicting what remained in the houses, agricultural work, manufacturing work, taking care of the camps themselves, cleaning the dorms, etc. Teletvinsky, camp number 4, was also a work camp, and Khaled, camp number, Teletvinsky was in the military base of the same name at the time. Today, that military base is called Tel HaShomer. It still exists. And Khaled is camp number 5. It was also a work camp. It was in the houses of the village by the name of Khaled in present-day Netanya. And like I said, the camps were sites also of forced labor. We interviewed one former POW by the name of Dr. Adnan Yahya, who mentioned, we asked him what happened if someone refused to work, and his answer was that a machine gun would be brought and that person would be threatened with execution. So people were obliged to work. Also, there was an issue of the food rations, which were rather small, but people who worked received more food than people who did not work. But as mentioned, there were very few people who could actually choose not to work. So a bit about the deportations, which was the main use of the camp. 78% of the people in the camps were deported from them outside of Palestine. The picture here is from the archive called Yad Tabenkin. It is from the personal archive of an Israeli officer by the name of Aryeh Harel Steinberg, who was the Israeli military's liaison to the International Committee of the Red Cross at the time. And the photo depicts one quote-unquote prisoner exchange in Jerusalem. Now, the Zionist narratives on 1948 contain two contradicting stories. One, that there were no expulsions in 1948, the other, that the expulsions happened in the heat of battle, and these camps clearly prove otherwise. There was no heat of battle when one is deported from a prisoner of war camp, and yet, like I said, 78% of the people were deported from these camps. Now, generally, the numbers in the 1948 war, in the Nakba, are that 770,000 Palestinians were deported outside of Palestine, and about 156,000 people were allowed to stay in the areas that the State of Israel was founded upon and came to control. So that leads to 83%. And like you can see, these numbers, 83% generally in Palestine and 78% in the camps, are rather close to one another. So the calm circumstances certainly did not exclude deportation. So that was a central use of these camps. Just to remind ourselves that we are not just talking about numbers, but actual people. This is Dr. Adnan Yahya, who I mentioned earlier with regard to forced labor. We interviewed Dr. Yahya for the booklet, and you can read the full interview in the booklet. The picture on the left is Dr. Yahya in 1948. He was not a doctor yet, but he did speak 3 languages at the time, Hebrew, Arabic, and English. He was born and raised in Tantura, and his family also owned a house in Haifa. In 1948, when the massacre in Tantura happened and the village was occupied and its inhabitants expelled, Dr. Yahya first was led to the Jewish settlement of Zichron Yaakov, and then into Khaled, the prisoner of war camp number 5, and he also was then later transferred to camp number 1, Jlel, and he spent about a year in these 2 camps. Then he was deported through Jerusalem. He made his way to Nablus, where he had an uncle. From Nablus, continued to Damascus, and eventually ended up in Germany, where he lives today. He still hopes to return to his native village of Tantura, and that's the sign that he's holding, returning to Tantura. Subject formation is a main trait of these camps. Generally, when people discuss prisoner of war camps or prisons, a lot of narratives include them being sites only for housing people, so hangars for housing people until the time comes that they can be released in some sort of prisoner exchange deal, but that is a limited way of looking at either prisoner of war camps or prisons. A different prism to look at these sites through is that of subject formation as places that attempt to change a person, to affect their behavior, identity, sense of self. And the 1948 camps did have this dimension very strongly within them. In brackets, I'll say that Israeli prisons post-October 7, which we will hear from Sahar in a few moments, definitely do not include a strong vector of subject formation. Things have changed drastically, but in 1948, it was part of the story. Mainly the goal of this subject formation was to turn Palestinians into loyal workers. The picture here, which I will translate in a second, is a letter that people would receive when they left the prison. This specific pamphlet was written by someone by the name of Rehabam Amir, who was the military governor of the Western Galilee and the villages of Haifa district. So I think it's worth quoting at length. So let me read the pamphlet. A letter to the released person. Our blessing on the day of your return to your family. Your family members' care, the local military government's efforts, and the Israeli government's kind-heartedness brought you back. I wish you that you would soon forget the hard times and troubles caused to you by the fault of bad advisors who asked to foul the relations between you and the just rule of the Israeli government. The government has gracefully answered my requests and recommendations and agreed to allow you to reconstitute your life and bring back happiness to your family's life. Return to a life of productive work, take care of your family, make your parents and children happy, and be a loyal citizen of the state of Israel. Remember the troubles were caused by those arousing conflict. Remember that those who pretended to save you are the ones who subjected you. Remember what happened to you when you were deceived by them. So that is this pamphlet that people received upon their exit of the camps. And I think the pamphlet really shows sort of the goals attempted to achieve, that the Israelis attempted to achieve within the camps. You might have noticed the contradiction there between, on the one hand, forgetting the pain caused to you by the fault of bad advisors. On the other hand, remembering the troubles that were caused by those arousing conflict. So there's a contradiction there. One is supposed to forget the pain of the camps while remembering the reasons for this pain. And a life of productive work is really the central of it, being focused not on politics or anything of the sort, but taking care of one's family. That was the goal of the Israeli efforts within the camps. There were several propaganda pieces in place, what the Israelis already at the time started to call hasbara, in order to transform people into loyal workers. There were newspapers. The two famous ones were El Yom and Hakikat El Amal, Zionist newspapers in the Arabic language that were meant to help better control the Palestinian population in what then became Israel as a whole, but also specifically the prisoners of war. They were brought these newspapers. There were radio shows, again, Israeli radio networks broadcasting in Arabic that were there to promote the Israeli propaganda efforts. There were also pamphlets given to prisoners of war within the camps. And one document gives the second title, Mental Process from Palestine to Israel, to these processes. And I think that definitely sums it up. The camps were also laboratories for what I call here 48ization. So 1948 Palestinians are the Palestinians who could remain in Palestine and the areas that Israel came to control. And the camps were laboratories for using propaganda against the 1948 Palestinians, trying to mold them into controllable subjects as well. Every month, every commander of every camp would write a monthly hasbara report, a monthly propaganda report, where he would describe how the prisoners reacted to the propaganda laid before them in these radio shows, in the newspapers, in the pamphlets, etc. The idea was that the reactions of the POWs will be suggestive as to how these propaganda methods work with the general population of 1948 Palestinians. And these reports, we still have them. We can read them today. There's many advice by these camp commanders to change this newspaper, to change its name, to diversify the material. You can read some examples for that in the booklet. The last thing I'll talk about is prisoners' resistance. So obviously, Hasbara efforts are very limited in form. They very rarely achieve their goals, and definitely the prisoners didn't buy into these efforts. One example is that there was a representative of the Foreign Office who offered to the prisoner representatives his help in orchestrating and organizing the cultural life of the camp. The prisoner representative who I mentioned earlier, Yusuf Sayel, said, quote, "Let me remind you of the difference between cultural activity and propaganda," end quote. So the prisoners were very aware of these efforts being made to affect their subjectivity and resisted these attempts. Another form of resistance was the first hunger strike, a collective hunger strike that took place in May 1949 in Camp Salafand. There was a final group of 744 prisoners at that point were yet to be released. The Israeli government asked to deport them to Jordan. The Jordanian government, however, refused to accept them, noting that they had family members in Palestine, in the areas that Israel came to control, that asked that they be released. The prisoners themselves also asked to be released within Palestine, within the areas Israel controlled, and to be free. So the Palestinian political prisoner Walid Daka, who recently died in prison due to medical neglect, refers to these kinds of resistances as the sumud within. The sumud within. Generally making prisoners resist these attempts, the carceral attempts of subject formation and clinging to one's own subjectivity, internal, both because these are prisoners inside prisons and also because it is a job done within, sort of with one's own subjectivity, resisting these attempts to change who a person is. So that is one kind of resistance. The other kind is the hunger strike for actually remaining in Palestine, the sumud itself asking not to be deported. And we don't know the result of this specific hunger strike, but we do know that 22% of Palestinians who were in these camps managed not to be deported and stayed within historic Palestine and the areas that Israel came to control. So I'll stop with that. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Shai, for this enlightening presentation of a very dark subject. I read the texts many times, of course, and it's still shocking every time to read this propaganda and duplicity of welcoming ex-prisoners when they're finally released, and speaking about the benevolence of the state. And unfortunately, all of this is still with us today. And to hear more about that, we will turn to our second guest, and we are very honored to have with us Sahar Francis, who is a Palestinian human rights defender, an attorney, who has been defending Palestinian prisoners, fighting for prisoners' rights and doing advocacy on their behalf for many, many years. And Sahar will be speaking about the reality of Palestinian prisoners today and of war crimes that are currently ongoing. So Sahar, thank you so much for being with us, and please, the floor is yours.
Good evening, everyone, and thanks for Zochrot for inviting me to share this webinar and to share with Shai. Actually, all what you were describing is still just, it's amazing how the same policies were used and repeated and very well established and developed in all these decades, and definitely continued after the occupation in 1967. So before talking more and describing the reality now in the prisons for all the more than 9,900 Palestinian prisoners held inside the Israeli prisons, I just wanted to highlight these connections and the extension of the same practices and laws and policies that were used immediately after 48 and continued in the occupied territories after 67. You all remember that the Palestinians who remained inside the state were subjected for military control, for a military system from 48 till 66. And in this military system, lots of military laws were developed. And of course, the British security regulations that made the basics for the security regulations that were amended and incorporated in the military system in the 67 area occupied territories were also used in the 48 areas: the arbitrary detention, the administrative detention, the deportation, lots of freedom movement restrictions, the system of the military permits that were imposed on Palestinians in their villages and so on. And actually, immediately after the occupation in 67, the same system were brought to be implemented, especially the military orders that were developed. And of course, it just shows that they were preparing for the occupation. It wasn't an act of self-defense. They were strategizing to continue and to complete the program. And when they occupied, they immediately, instead of applying the international law, and especially the international humanitarian law, the Fourth Geneva Convention and the other treaties, they started to develop the military orders, and they invented the 5 military courts at that time that they were active in the occupied territories. They annexed East Jerusalem, of course, and separated it from the rest of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so far, till today, they continued even after the Oslo Agreement and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority to issue the military orders and to control and to maintain the control over the whole occupied territories. We have now more than 2,000 military orders that actually interfere and control the whole life of the Palestinian people in the occupied territories. And the mass incarceration was always the main tool to control the population, to oppress and to punish and to deport in order to control the land and so on. They criminalized in these military orders every action of not just resistance, even cultural activities, sport activities, social activities. Charitable organizations were declared illegal according to the military orders and declared terrorist groups in order to justify arresting people who were trying to work and support and keep the resilience for the Palestinian people. And this is the way how they were legalizing these strategies of mass incarceration and control over the Palestinians. Another very important point we should keep in mind that all what we as human rights organizations, lawyers, and people who were focusing on the occupation in these decades and what we were describing as war crimes and calling that Israel is practicing apartheid and discriminating policies, especially via the military system, the military courts, and the imprisonment policies. Now, after the decision of the International Justice Court, I mean the advisory opinion on the legality and the illegality of the occupation, became very clear that all what we were describing is correct, that the occupation itself now is illegal and it should end immediately or as soon as possible, and states, third states, cannot be complicit or cannot benefit from these crimes that were described in this advisory opinion, although the advisory opinion is not mentioning the prisoners as a separate case. But of course, we can learn much about the practices in the military system, in the courts, and in the procedures of the imprisonment, the punishments, the treatment for the prisoners, from the description about the apartheid and the discrimination policies and the illegalities of these practices. I'm highlighting this point because, in my opinion, we should now focus in a different way about the whole military system and the imprisonment and the crimes that are used systematically in this system against the Palestinian population. So for the reality, because I think it's really very, very interesting to see the similarities on the practices when you were talking about deportation and expulsion. It's the same that was used in the early years of the occupation in the 70s and the 80s, and how they were arresting people, sending them for administrative detention for a couple of months, and then to be deported outside of the occupied territories. Actually, thousands of people were deported in very similar ways, not allowed to return to the occupied territories in these years. Even after the Oslo Agreement with the Palestinian Authority, the Israeli occupation were deporting in between the two different sides of the occupied territories, between the West Bank to Gaza. Lots of prisoners, whether in the exchange deals or in the Second Intifada period, were deported based on decisions from the Israeli High Court, the case of Ajuri, that confirmed the deportation policy from the West Bank to the Gaza Strip. And I'm sure that it's the same strategy that would be forced in any exchange deal now. Expulsion of prisoners, not just from the occupied territories, but also outside the occupied territories, exactly like happened in the church in Bethlehem in 2000, when they expelled more than 40 people who were sieged in the church for Europe at that time. So it's still the same strategies that is implemented by the Israeli occupation. What is going, although we know that it's the same strategies and the war crimes continuing, but it's still very shocking to see what was happening immediately after the 7th of October in the prisons, inside the prisons, against the prisoners who were sitting there before the 7th of October, and against the thousands that they were arrested after the 7th of October. Actually, we had 5,200, 300 Palestinian prisoners before the 7th of October. And immediately with the war, they started to arrest hundreds from all of the occupied territories, from East Jerusalem, from the West Bank, from the Gaza Strip. And we never succeeded to know the accurate number of those who were arrested from the Gaza Strip, whether were arrested inside Israel in the first week or so, mostly workers who were working in Israel, or later in the in the time of the genocidal war. But currently we know that the total number of those who were arrested from the West Bank, it's over 10,000 people, where they arrested more than 700 children, more than 345 women. They issued more than 8,300 administrative detention orders. The total number of those from the West Bank and the Gazans detainees that they are classified as illegal competent or unlawful competents, that they are arrested in the prison system and prisons under the prison authority, they are around 9,900 in total. But we don't know how many prisoners from Gaza are held in the detention under the army. Because also in the first days of the war, the Israelis announced that they will use military bases as detention facilities. And this is how they started to use the Sde Teiman detention facility, actually the military base, as a detention facility. And they started to arrest thousands and bring them from the Gaza Strip to the Sde Teiman. Also, they declared about Anatot, another military base that is located near Jerusalem, as a detention facility. And later on, we discovered that they also opened a military base in Ofer, in between the military court and the prison under the prison authority, as a military detention facility. Now they are trying to move all those from Sde Teiman to the Ofer detention facility, of course, after the like the exposure about the Sde Teiman and the horrible crimes committed in the Sde Teiman. It's not the first time, or it's not a new policy, that the torture, the killings, the arbitrary detention, the degrading treatment is used in a widespread, systematic manner. It was always the case that the prisoners were suffering from degrading treatment, from humiliation, from sexual abuse, including rape in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and very severe, different traditional, typical methods of torture were used in these years as well. The harsh sentences, the bad conditions inside the prisons, and prisoners were launching hunger strike, mostly collective hunger strikes in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. People died in hunger strike inside the Israeli prison. The forcible, the force feeding were used against Palestinian prisoners in the longest hunger strike, in the strike in 1981, and 3 detainees died after the force feeding were implemented. And this is why the High Court banned the policy for several years, till actually in 2015 they initiated a separate legislation to make it legal, the force feeding. And individual hunger strikes started to be more used as a strategy, especially by administrative detainees in after 2011, after actually the exchange deal, known as the Shalit exchange deal, because Israel continued to use the administrative detention in a very widespread manner. And the individual hunger strikes caused in what we faced in 2023, the death of Khadir Adnan, unfortunately, one of the main detainees who used the hunger strike systematically as the main tool to resist the oppression of the detention. Although in the last time he wasn't under administrative detention, but still he believed that his detention was arbitrary and he used hunger strike. But what happened after the 7th of October, they totally disconnected the prisoners from the outside world. They canceled all the family visits. Up till today, there's no family visits. They canceled all the Red Cross visits. The Red Cross is the only international body that is able to visit prisoners. For several weeks, they also canceled the lawyers' visits. Now we can visit, but under lots of restrictions. They confiscated all the properties and the clothes and the books, the newspapers, everything from the rooms of the prisoners. They started with the starvation policy. In most of the prisons, they cut the electricity, the water, and they were locking the prisoners 24 hours a day in their rooms. In the best cases, they started to offer them 1 hour or half an hour recreation time outside of their rooms. The most severe thing was the physical attacks against the prisoners, the raids to their rooms for security searches and without excuses in some cases, and killing, like beating and attacking them with wooden sticks or the weapons or whatever till death. They caused a death of 22 people in these months out of physical attacks or health neglect policies. One of them, of course, Walid Daqqa. But we don't know the exact number of those from Gaza who died under torture in the Sde Teiman detention facility. And it's just lately that we started to know more and more about the conditions that the Gazan prisoners faced in the Sde Teiman. And it's really beyond description. Sometimes I have no words how to describe testimonies of prisoners that they survived sexual harassment, sexual abuse, including rape with using sticks or other tools. I think all of you were aware about the case that was published in the Israeli media just today. The court released the 5 soldiers who were suspicious with this case of sexual abuse. And honestly, from our experience with the Israeli system, when it comes for torture cases and other crimes committed against the prisoners, it's almost zero results of investigation and serious accountability against the perpetrators. And this is why I doubt how this case will end up as well. And I believe all this investigation were done in order to show the international level, especially the International Criminal Court, after issuing the warrant arrest or threatening to issue the warrant arrest against the Prime Minister and the Minister of Defense in the ICC to avoid such international accountability. They want to show the world that here we are investigating these serious crimes and we will find the perpetrators accountable. But the killing of the people from Gaza, that we don't know the number and who these people are and in which circumstances they were killed. There is a forcible disappearances intentional policy used against people from Gaza. Hundreds of people, of prisoners, we cannot allocate them where they are detained and for what reasons and in which conditions. The forcible transfer, actually all the prisoners from the occupied territories, whether from the West Bank or from the Gaza Strip, are forcibly transferred for prisons located inside the state. This is by itself is a war crime, actually. The administrative detention as arbitrary detention, or even the unlawful competent law, because You talked, Shai, about the prisoners of war. Actually, this is a very important legal discussion around what's the status of the Palestinian prisoners. Actually, the majority of the prisoners would be considered as civilians because these people were not involved in any militant action. They were arrested as civilians, even if you were belonging for an armed group. But when you were arrested, you were not in the middle of a militant clash. According to the international humanitarian law, you would be classified as a civilian, and you should be deserved to be protected according to the 4th Geneva Convention with all the rights respected there, which Israel systematically violated every aspect in the 4th Geneva Convention when it comes for the protection of the prisoners, definitely not offering a fair trial procedures in the military system that was imposed in all these thousands of prisoners. So I think the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that were committed, whether in 48 or later, in the early years of the occupation, are still continuing. And this is what it makes it, after the ICJ ruling, essential and urgent, not just to stop these crimes and to put all the efforts from all stakeholders, whether states, UN agencies, or others, to stop the occupation with all the crimes committed, but also the accountability element. Without accountability, I think it will never send a clear message that you cannot, as a state and as a society, commit such severe genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity and run away without being accountable. Actually, this will affect the whole understanding and implementation of the international law and the international order, and not just in relation to the Palestinian people and the Palestinian prisoners, but everywhere in the world, if Israel succeeds to get away with all these war crimes and crimes against humanity. Thank you.
Sahar, thank you so much for this very clear and knowledgeable presentation, and for all the important work that you do. I'll open the floor for questions or comments for anyone who wants to engage with our panelists on what we've just heard. And I maybe start with my own question to you, Sahar. We've seen through the years a lot of resistance organized from within the prisons, and Shai talked a little bit about that. Of course, the concept of Sumud within, that Walid Daka taught us, and Shai talked about the prisoners' strike in 1949, and there have been many strikes since. And what is the situation now? I assume that under such conditions, even the resistance that we saw before is practically impossible, but maybe you can say a bit more about that.
I think currently it's very, very difficult to initiate any action of resistance. Definitely not a hunger strike. Anyway, the pictures of the released prisoners really reflects a very, very harsh conditions when it comes for the poor food that is offered for the prisoners. Most of the released people report losing more than 20-30 kilograms in these months in detention. So the hunger strike, I don't think it would be a tool that would be used currently. And because of the level of physical attacks and violence and the brutality of the police guards in the prisons, I think it's very harsh. The prisoners wouldn't risk also resisting in this atmosphere because they know that would be easily attacked, and especially because in these months, like different Israeli and Palestinian human rights organizations were talking, alerting, and Israeli colleagues, human rights organizations were petitioning the Israeli High Court over the conditions of the prisoners in the, and unfortunately they didn't interfere. They didn't issued any decision that really accept the fact that these policies are considered as violations for the international law. And so I think the prisoners realizing that it's not a good atmosphere and condition. And of course, the people, usually we should know that any act of resistance inside the prison should be accompanied with solidarity and support from the outside. They cannot succeed if they are left alone struggling inside the prison. Usually they rely on the society, on the supporters in order, especially when they initiate hunger strike, to support them. So in the current period where in these months we all are focusing on the genocide in Gaza, it's very hard to talk about collective hunger strike inside the prisons.
Thank you, Sahar. Mohanad is here. You had a question? Just a second. Oh, here you are. Hi, Mohanad. Please.
يعطيكم العافية سحر وشاي. Just a note, يعني Palestinian prisoners are hungry, are already hungry. They're being starved since the 7th of October. We can see the pictures of the released Palestinian prisoners who are يعني in loss of weight. So I don't think that, as well as what Sahar said, يعني a hunger strike should be accompanied by a struggle outside the prisons. I have a question or a note for both Dr. Gottlieb and Sahar. I repeatedly heard that what happened in 48 and alongside the whole 74 years of occupation is a continuous policy. But my question is, can we say that it was a continuous policy until the morning of 7th of October? I mean, until the 6th of October, the Israeli authorities, the occupation, tried to contain the Palestinian political prisoners movement in several and in diverse ways. But starting from that morning, they moved on. I mean, they shifted from trying to erase the political movement into erasing the bodies of the prisoners. For instance, one of the simplest examples today in the prisons, the scabias, they're torturing. They are really torturing the prisoners with this with crowded cells, lack of clothes, lack of cleaning materials, lack of medical care. And it's like a shift of policy from trying to contain the political icon of the Palestinian prisoners movement to erase the bodies and the souls of the prisoners. I'm not sure if it was a question, but you can consider it. I'm sorry for talking so long.
Thanks, Mohanad. Sahar, do you want to comment on that?
Shall I go ahead, or you have something to say? Thanks. Mohannad, thanks for the question. I totally agree with the argument that the level of humiliation and intimidation is the aim to break the soul of the people inside the prison, definitely. When you take cases of prisoners from Gaza, for example, the Dr. El-Bursh that died under torture, imagine him in his position to be tortured, humiliated, and treated in such humiliation. I think like it's really the intention is to break the soul of the people. Why you would ask a detainee that he's handcuffed 24 hours a day and shackled in his legs, when you count as a police his number in the counting of the detainees, after saying his number, you order him to kneel on the ground in the praying, you know, the Muslim praying position, sujood in Arabic. I don't know how to translate it in English. This is just for humiliation. This is how people from Gaza are treated. All these images that were leaked to the media are correct, and the situation is even worse than what you saw in the media, in the different reports about the daily humiliation of the detainees in the positions, in the food, even offering the food, the little food that they offer them, the way how it's offered in Sde Teiman, for example, that the soldiers push the bread on the ground by their feet. It's in order to humiliate them and intimidate them, allowing dogs to attack the detainees and pee on the detainees, or opening the mouth of a detainee as a soldier, and you would throw in his mouth. Several actions that are used in a systematic and widespread manner in these months. I think the main aim is to break the soul of the people. Yeah.
Shai, you have anything to add?
Yeah, very briefly. So thank you, Mohammed, for that note. I recently concluded a book on the Israeli incarceration of Palestinian political prisoners, on carceral subjectivity and the exercise of freedom within the Israeli prison system. And the periodization that I gave this book is until the 7th of October, 2023. So I completely agree that there's a very significant break before and after the 7th of October, 2023. And I'm not sure that we can yet fully grasp everything that has happened in the carceral system since then. The stories have come out, and there have been several reports by Adamir, by the UN, by B'Tselem recently, but we're still trying to understand what happened there. Generally, in political theory, we would say that there was a shift from subjectification to subjection. So subjectification is an attempt to affect who the prisoners are, then their sense of self. So for example, in the Oslo years, there was a known attempt by the Israeli carceral system to make the prisoners more amenable to the Oslo process. So that's an example of subjectification. And now the prisoner's subjectivity doesn't seem to be of any importance to the Israeli carceral system. Like Zochrot said, it's an attempt to break them. So subjection would be the word, something very different than all the history that precedes it from 1948 until the 7th of October. So yeah, it's a very significant break.
Thank you so much, Shai. Okay, we have a question from Najwan. She asked me to read it. Speaking of international law and accountability, are there any Palestinian collective efforts to gather solidarity groups or lawyers at the international legal level to hold Israeli soldiers and the system accountable for these detention camps that you're hopeful about? Do you think these efforts could be fruitful? Sahar, did you hear the question?
Yes, I'm not so optimistic, to be honest. After seeing the way how the office of the prosecutor in the International Criminal Court dealt with the Palestinian case, even before the 7th of October, the way how it was taking much more time to investigate and to take all the referral reports that were submitted by either the Palestinian NGOs or the Palestinian Authority or even some Israeli NGOs or international sites that they submitted information around war crimes and crimes against humanity. It wasn't taken so seriously. And after the 7th of October, we believe that the case of the prisoners were not highlighted as such in a way that really reflects seriousness in the investigation in the serious crimes committed against the prisoners. Although several like information came from the office that they are investigating, they are continuing, the investigation is not over. So I want still to believe that they will do something. But I think we have a duty as Palestinian lawyers and Palestinian organizations to continue working and invest efforts in exhausting on the international level, not just the like the option of the International Criminal Court, but as well every opportunity of universal jurisdiction procedures, like in different states, that they are obliged to prosecute war crimes and crimes against humanity, torture, target killings, and unfair trial procedures, and so on. So, and not just in countries, in the European countries that we already know that they will block the Palestinian victims, but we have to explore other options like in Latin America, in Africa, and other more friendly countries, let's say, especially now after the genocide war, there is a more awareness on the importance of such actions in order to protect the international law system, not just in favor of the Palestinians. I mean, when we say it shouldn't be repeated or it shouldn't happen anywhere, really it shouldn't happen anywhere. No one should be tortured till death.
Thank you, Sahar. Another important question that I see here is how how do you collect information, and especially on the detainees and captives from Gaza that you said are not getting any visitations at all, but in general, how are we getting information from
actually, several colleagues, organizations in Gaza, like Al Mizan and PCHR and the Damir in Gaza, they're meeting detainees because some of those detainees are released back to Gaza. But also, we should highlight that I think there is some detainees that they disappeared. The army confirmed that they were released in such a date in January or later, and the families says they never reached Gaza. We don't know where these people disappeared. And there's also, since May actually, there's more visits enabled for the detainees from Gaza, especially those that they are classified as unlawful competence. So there's more collection of testimonies from direct meetings with the detainees inside the prisons.
Thank you so much, Sahar. I'll give you each the opportunity for closing words. If you have any more to say that we haven't covered yet, and we will finish with this. Shai, do you want to add anything?
Just to say thank you again to Zochrot for organizing this evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Sahar?
Me too. I would just thank you so much for this opportunity, and I hope that we can continue such collective work and efforts in order to end this colonization.
Thank you. And Omar, who is the co-author of the booklet, and my colleague at Zochrot has a question to end this discussion. Please.
Well, thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Shai and Sahar. No, actually, I'm not sure if this is a question, but I would like to hear more from Shai how the detention camps were used as a tool for ethnic cleansing already in 1948. And if Sahar sees that also the matter and the object of the mass detention of Palestinians from Gaza is also used for this matter, because arresting so many people, have some thousands of people, it's not for punishing the persons for doing something, it's something beyond that the Israeli authorities want to achieve. So do you see any hints of what is the policy beyond this massive detention, more than torturing or abusing the persons, the individuals? And Shai, if you can say a few words, how did you see this policy as a policy, not personal, transferring people or kicking out people from Palestine, but as a policy of the government? Shai, did you hear me?
I can start. So the policy is clear from the actions. 78% of the Palestinians in these camps were expelled, deported. They wanted to stay, but they were not given the option to stay. There were literal trucks coming to the camps, loading prisoners and taking them to the Mandelbaum point in Jerusalem and deporting them to Jerusalem and then to the West Bank, then controlled by Jordan. So the policy is clear from the action itself. I think things were, unfortunately, the horrors were more straightforward in 1948, where sort of things have become more complicated. But like you say, Omar, the logic itself of maintaining a Jewish majority over the land by means of transfer is a continuous logic that we can see in 1948, and we can see it today as well.
I think I would connect it with the genocide, because if we review the Genocide Convention, part of the actions there is specifically related to the torture and causing physical and mental destruction. And like this is totally connected, what happened in 48, if we consider the Nakba as the start of the genocidal action against the Palestinian people as a collective, it's still continuing, and it was all the time. The torture was one of the main tools in the colonization project, whether in 48 and later after in the 67, and definitely now what's going on in Gaza. So of course the torture and the physical and the psychological torture could be part of the genocidal actions.
Thank you both so much. I want to thank Omar as well, and all of our team at Zochrot for making this evening and all of our work possible. Thank you all for being here, for listening. I just want to say and continue what both Sahar and Mohanad talked about this effort to crush any attempt of solidarity with the prisoners, with Palestinians in general, and really crush physically the bodies of Palestinians. And I think the only answer we have for that is to do solidarity even harder. And I know you are all with us in that. And please continue to tell these truths and come again to learn with us. Visit our website to learn more. If you want to organize a talk about the Nakba or a tour to your group, please write to us, and we welcome the continuation of this discussion. And we will be here and continue in whatever way we can until Palestine is free. Shai, Sahar, thank you so much for joining us and for teaching us. And thank you all very much. Have a good evening.